I didn't think I'd be doing a second part to this, but I've learned a lot of new information over the past month. So, let's take a look at some of the stories of the NASCAR Sportsman Division. The sportsman drivers came from all over, both in terms of location and walks of life. Bob Fox Jr. of New York maybe exemplifies them. He was a metal worker who raced in the sportsman division using his life savings. Robin Caldwell of South Carolina owned an airbrush business, and he sure applied his skills to his race car, as his paint scheme was beautiful. Interestingly, Caldwell's chassis dated back to 1979, meaning his race car was about 200 pounds heavier than everyone else's. For Glenn Darnell of Virginia, the Sportsman Division was a great way to spend his retirement. Glenn had no prior motorsport experience, yet despite being in his early 60s, he was actually pretty quick. Gary Everett was another one of the older drivers. Nicknamed Red, Everett, who ran a restaurant in Spartanburg, South Carolina, was well into his 50s by the time the Sportsman Division came around. He fielded one of the very few two-car teams in the Sportsman Division, his teammate being Jerry Rector, who was also from South Carolina and was a veteran short tracker. From the older drivers to the youngest driver to race in Sportsman was Stephen Howard, a late model driver from Greer, South Carolina, who made his Sportsman debut when he was 20. This was the case for the majority of Sportsman drivers. They raced late models, street stocks, midgets, whatnot, at mostly local speedways in North and South Carolina, maybe in Georgia or Virginia. However, there were some from Pennsylvania, New York, and even some from as far out as Nevada. Some of them still race, in fact. The go-to model for the Sportsman Division was the Chevrolet Monte Carlo. These cars were cheap, about $8,000, which for a race car isn't half bad, and were quite aerodynamic. Chevy Luminas were very rare in Sportsman, but they were used a little bit at the end. Pontiac Grand Prix were pretty common early on, both in the regular format and the 2x2, but usage fell off as the division wore on. Only one driver, Charles Schaffner, used one in 94, and no one used one in 95. Only about 3 or 4 drivers total used the Ford Thunderbird in Sportsman, but 2 of the users, Dennis Setzer and Henry Benfield, were regulars, so there was often one Ford in the field, usually only one. Buick LeSabre was a semi-frequent choice for some of the front runners and the midfielders. Regals were mostly used by the backmarkers. Oldsmobiles became more and more popular as the division marched on. They were at first pretty infrequent, but at the end they were very common. They of course used the Cutlass. The Chrysler LeBaron was usually not allowed in NASCAR events, but on occasion and in the lower divisions, NASCAR would make exceptions to field-to-field. Michael Levatera of Connecticut is the only known Chrysler user in Sportsman. He used one at Pocono in 1993. A couple drivers did use some of the old Busch models, which were the Nova, the Skylark, the Omega, and the Ventura, but these were phased out by, at the very latest, 1991. And next up, you know what, let's just get this out of the way. Let's address the black sheep in the room. Now that that's over with, let's get to something a little more interesting. I'm just going to be going through some stories rapid fire. These won't be in any particular order, so, well, here we go. The car that Richie Petty was injured in that 1991 race was recently found in a barn. Occasional Mike Harmon driver Roger Roos, racing sportsman, using a rear-steer Buick, once used by Bobby Allison as a test car. This spin in the first sportsman race by Kent Trader crewman Henry Benfield was reportedly on purpose after Benfield misheard an instruction from his crew chief. In order to cut costs, sportsman teams used old cup tires that had once been used at Daytona and Talladega, which were very, very hard. This meant that they didn't need to make a tire stop, but at Pocono did have to make a fuel stop. Well, usually. Jerry Knowles won a race at Pocono in 1993 by staying out the whole way. American businessman Leo Hendry, who later headed AT&T and the Yes Network for the New York Yankees, ran a few sportsman races in 1995. Drivers got their cars from all over. A lot of their cars had histories. Glenn Darnell's was once run by Neil Bonnet. Robert Wooten's Chevrolet was once a Pontiac Ventura barrel-rolled by Rodney Howard at Daytona in 1983. Virginia businessman Paul Shaver, who raced everything from stock cars to Formula Renault, and from trophy trucks to airplanes, ran an ex-Elton Sawyer Chevrolet. And Todd Bodine's sportsman car was once run by his brother Jeff. Sportsman teams had to have a crew chief and a spotter. For most teams, they were the same person. Australians Kim Jane and Terry Sawyer made the trip over to compete in 1990. Jane did pretty well in his one start, however, Sawyer was caught up in David Gaines's crash, and the only time she took the green flag, she wrecked out. Ron Saberins was the only driver ever sent to the hospital after an incident at Pocono. In 1991, he collapsed after getting out of his car due to carbon monoxide. According to Morris Spice, 57 cars entered the final sportsman weekend. New York dirt tracker Wyatt Earp rented out the Days of Thunder car used in sportsman festivities in October 1990. He finished midfield. Marty Ward, Tom Sherrill, and Jerry Rector are the only three drivers who ran at least one sportsman race every year. Though later disproven by photos, Brad Everett apparently insists to this day that the first person on scene after his heavy 1994 crash was fellow driver Doug Bennett, whose car had blown up earlier in the race. While most sportsman paint schemes were very simple, there were a couple beauties, such as, of course, Robin Caldwell and David R. Smith, as seen here. Local driver Jeffrey Ninneman also had a pretty nice car. Ugly paint schemes are very subjective, but William Metzger's number 0 really wasn't pleasant. During practice for a race in October 1994, Joe Guida's car blew up, so he took over the car of Henry Benfield, his teammate. While the broadcast crew was told, apparently the scorers were not, so they still scored Benfield in the car. Top Cop Racing was a charity in Florida that organized races at local speedways for police officers to participate in. All proceeds from these races would go to the charity. Fred Costanza, a Top Cop competitor, did a couple of sportsman races in 93 and 94. This guy's name is Derek Countryman, and there's nothing else to it, I just think that's a cool name. Qualifying for the 1991 Richmond race was rained out, the drivers drew for the pole. Doug Sanders ended up drawing the pole. He said that at the time of the drawing he didn't have an engine in his car. A couple cars had multiple drivers. Dale Lamont, who would later own and be killed at the Langley Speedway, drove a number 43 car in 1991 before it was sold to Paul Shaver. Dale McDowell drove the number 91 Way Crazy Oldsmobile in May 1995. He left the team after the May festivities and was replaced by Morris Spice. And the Buick that Roger Roos raced in October 1990 was once driven by Stanley Smith. Smith left the team, owned by Roger's father, because he had just picked up Interstate Batteries as a sponsor and was moving up. Speaking of sponsors, sportsman sponsors included Ramsey's Condoms on the car of Sherry Blakely, Horseplay, a Western apparel store on the car of Ronnie Sewell, and Trotter Bail Bonds, Jerry Rector's sponsor. This was Kirk Shelmerdeed's car for the very first sportsman race. And this was his car for the second. Gary Bradbury, who later ran in Cup for Jimmy Means, made a few sportsman starts in 1990. Though she mostly ran the number 61, Sherry Minner ran the 87 in her first sportsman year. And speaking of Minner, her background was that she was married to Harry Melling mechanic Tommy Johnson. Minner was a very frequent pole sitter in sportsman, but never seemed to finish the race. And to finish up, Here was Ward Burton before the first sportsman race. Ward's pretty famous for his accent. Did he have it when he was 27?
Well, I'm looking real forward to it. You know, I just hope everybody use their head and then try to win on the first lap.
The Greensboro newspaper announced in 1990 that there was a plan to put Daytona on the sportsman calendar for 1991. Would this really have been the big mess that you'd think it would have been? I say no. Hear me out on this one. There already was an amateur series which ran at Daytona, that being the Goody's Dash series. The Dash cars were compacts. They were much slower and much lighter than Cup cars. However, their weight and aerodynamics led to them being very, very hard to control at Daytona. The lightweight and easy energy dissipation meant that crashes rarely resulted in serious injury. Now, of course, sportsman cars were full-body Winston Cup cars, but this is the same reason why I believe that the Daytona race would have been nothing more than a big bore fest. As mentioned earlier, the tires that the Sportsman Division used have once been used at Daytona and Talladega by Winston Cup teams. These tires were cheap, very hard, and gripped the track with ease. This meant that, as a run wore on, it would be harder and harder to slow down for a crash. This, coupled with inexperience, led to many of the severe incidents in the Sportsman Division. Since slowing down for a crash wasn't practical, this meant that there were two choices: swerve or floor it on by. Often, crashes got much worse because drivers made the wrong choice, flooring it when they should be swerving, and vice versa. Big ones were infrequent at Pocono, because Pocono has a lot of room to run. Additionally, Pocono was run a little bit like a traditional superspeedway, meaning aerodynamics had to be taken into account. Since sportsman body styles were so different, this meant that aerodynamics were all over the place for the entire field. However, at Charlotte, there's not too much room to run, and aero isn't too important. However, the thing with both Pocono and Charlotte is that sportsman cars ran them wide open. So let's take a look at Daytona. At Daytona, there's no room to run even for the Cup Series. Throttles are almost always wide open, and proper understanding and application of aerodynamics is almost necessary. Sportsman cars weren't starting single file in 1991. However, I feel that if the field could spread itself out, which wouldn't be too tough due to the very different body styles that each car had, the race would probably go caution-free. Furthermore, due to the massive speed difference between the front runners and the back markers, it's likely that once the field got itself spread out, it would have turned into one big game of follow the leader, with several different groups. Of course, all we can do is theorize. Let me know what you think would have happened. So was the division really such a disaster? That's hard to say. Out of the 4 former sportsman drivers I've asked the question, all of them said that the division was the most fun they'd ever had in their career, including sportsman race winner Ronnie Sewell. And considering that Charlotte entry lists never really dropped below 55, it seemed like everyone else loved it too. Yeah, it was a bit of a joke, and yeah, it was below even ARCA, but gave a jump start to several drivers, including Robert Huffman and Mike Skinner, and the shows they put on were very rarely boring. A few races were held in 1996, which are sometimes considered to be Sportsman Division races, proving that even NASCAR found something in the division. But the old car format had been taken over by USAR, and the Hooters Pro Cup Series was on the rise, so NASCAR just let them have it. Now, would such a division fly today? Probably not, but considering the Scott's Easy Seed Legends race that was held at Bristol for a few years, anything is possible. Admittedly, that was just a bad idea. It's safe to say, though, that there will never be another series like the Sportsman Division. It was a unique piece of NASCAR history, and it left an impact on the motorsports world. If only that impact was more positive.